Hey guys, Loman02, currently doing a video recording on the Canadian Highlander format. This is going to be a little bit of a different recording, so I'm going to talk actually just more theory in this. We're going to go into one game, and I'm not going to cover this deck that's in front of you specifically in ad nauseum. I've covered this deck actually in my most recent video. This is Esper midrange, as I've called it Esper Deathblade, but honestly I think it may be kind of a misnomer to call this deck a midrange deck. I think it's really more of a lowered curve control deck is I kind of think what I'm going for, and it kind of ties into what I actually want to talk about in this video, which is kind of where control as an archetype I think has kind of gone or has to go, given the changes in the game over time, how the game has changed over time. So, Esper Deathblade you have in front of you, and actually, let me preface all of that. So, Canadian Highlander, if you are unfamiliar with my content or this is first time viewing, is a 100-card singleton format without sideboards. There is a sideboard in this one, but it's my building board. I don't bring the cards in. It is a 100-card singleton unified format, which has a vintage legal list, or is vintage legal. Everything that's legal in Magic vintage is legal here in Canadian Highlander. That all said, the most powerful cards in the history of Magic are pointed. You have 10 points per list to build your list, so not all the lists can run every single piece of Power 9. It's just not viable. A card like Ancestral Recall is 7 points out of 10, so that's why you'll see I'm not running it here. If I could run it, I probably would, because I love that card, and it's very good. That's it. If you're curious about that, please go onto Google and check out Canadian Highlander. I think they have a WordPress webpage that has all of their pointing systems in it. And if you're curious about the points that are in this list, only one of them has changed since I put out my last video and covered the points in it, and that is a Mana Drain over Spellseeker, right here. So that's the only point that I've changed in the list. I think Mana Drain does a little bit more work in the list. Before we kind of jump into the theory piece on this, let me cover the changes I've made in the deck. I actually put Custody Lich in just for this video. I don't run it on MTGO because this card is unfortunately bugged. Right now, the Scarab God is the placeholder for this card inside my deck. If you're familiar with Scarab God, it's a pretty bomby card. The problem that I have with Scarab God is it doesn't do enough when it comes into play. It is fairly resilient, but the issue I have is it doesn't do enough when it comes to play, and it's a Caracas. It's a card that's Caracas bait. Whereas Custody Lich, is obviously a much smaller body, and I think over a very long game is probably going to have a little less value, but it has immediate impact. It replaces itself with a card draw at the end of your turn. And in general, it's just probably a more powerful card in this format. And the Monarchy is just busted. Just busted. That's why you'll see I'm playing cards like, Palace Jailer. So Custody Lich in, and I believe there was one more change in the deck, but let me look real quickly, guys. Yeah, Plague Engineer got in. So I ended up cutting the Soulfire Grandmaster. That card was... So one of the issues you run into in Esper is you don't have a lot of good frontliners, creatures in the 2 CMC spot. So I ended up cutting the Soulfire Grandmaster, which... My thought on Soulfire Grandmaster was, this is a decent speed bump. It's a 2-2 that has lifelink, so it kind of keeps you alive longer if you're facing off against aggro. And then in the long game, if you draw it, you can just use it to recurse your spells, which is very powerful. So it kind of had some good scalability. But I felt like Plague Engineer just did a little bit more in more matchups for me. Like, against a tribal deck, this card's just a hard lock. Against D&T, they run a lot of humans. This can just kill a lot of things. It's kind of like a miniature Toxic Deluge that leaves behind a Grey Ogre, which is really good. It's a great kind of swingy card. It's good in a mid-range deck like this. Kills off a True Name Nemesis for pretty much free. Yeah, just all around a pretty decent card that I thought was probably more relevant in more matchups that I'd be facing than the Soulfire Grandmaster would. And at the end of the day, Soulfire Grandmaster is very inefficient. It requires a lot of mana to get kind of going. And we're a 36 land deck. We're not quite at the control levels of mana like the 37 plus Tithe or 38, 39 mana. So we're not quite there. And in addition to that, I believe I changed out one more card and ended up putting in the Tidehollow Sculler, just because I really have found that one of the distinguishing marks in Esper specifically, as opposed to Jeskai, which is kind of like the premier mid-range deck of the format, is that Esper has hand attack, right? Jeskai does not. Jeskai has the burn, and I think the burn is still likely better than having the hand attack, because burn is board control plus clock, whereas the removal that we're running in this deck is not clock. It's always just going to be removal, but it does scale better. It's generally more powerful. It's better against more powerful threats. That burn tends to kind of scale out of feasibility to deal with. But at that point, when you're at that point in the game, with Jeskai, you tend to just aim it ahead anyways because you can kind of tempo them out. which is one of the difficulties that I think Esper has, that it has more difficulty finding tempo lines. So I think instead it has to generally tend to find value lines, basically limiting and grinding out opponents' resources, getting as many 2-for-1s as possible, and then just eventually winning with whatever the last threat standing kind of is. And that may just be a 2-2 Palace Jailer or a Plague Engineer, but your opponent's down to 0 resources, and they're just basically hitting their top deck hoping to find a good resource. Well, you have 2 to 3 cards in hand that probably say counter target spell, or kill target creature, or discard another card, or maybe just another threat, whatever. So, those are the changes that I've made to the list. And I guess as far as typifying this list, I would say this honestly is more of a... So, a lot of decks scale, right? Like, I would say this is more on the controlling end of mid-range, which, is kind of where I want it to be, because, like, I've really been trying to find this deck's identity. I feel like Esper Control was kind of in a rough spot. One, the mana is always going to be a little bit of a problem in Esper. I mean, it works, but, like, you really have to mull into hands that both have the interaction that you desire in that given matchup, plus the mana in order to bring those cards to bear, bring those effects to bear. And, it doesn't tend to be a very threat-rich deck, so it has a tough time coming back from behind. I mean, it has, like, cards like Supreme Verdict, Wrath of God. It can have those effects. But every threat in Magic is just becoming so good that your Wraths are sort of becoming like 4-mana Doomblades. And that's not really where you want to be. Like, ideally, in those style of decks, like the old-school style control decks, you really want a 1-for-1, maybe let like 1 to 2 things through, get a 3-for-1 off your Wrath, get the untap after they've kind of run out of gas or developed, overdeveloped a little bit on the board, and then just try to win the game. When you have Planeswalkers that are afoot, that's a problem. That strategy is a problem now. And when you have like independent threats that just are so game-breaking, like, Palace Jailer is just a game-breaking card. Like, if you're playing a control deck and you see this thing, if this thing resolves, like, you probably just lost. Especially if you're a threat lean deck that's going to have a tough time with that. Same thing with like Custodial Lich. If you just drop this thing down, even if there's no creatures on the board for you to kill, like it just warps the game. And it's got a Flame Tongue Kavu body, so it can actually do damage. It can actually attack. It's not an irrelevant body. So these kind of cards like are just so game breaking. I mean, I call it like the Siege Rhino syndrome. Like, we just have so many independent cards that are so good at killing folks that if you miss once on a threat lean control deck, like, it often is just the death of you. You can't get back because it forces you into a reaction loop on your own turn to deal with whatever they played, and then they're resolving some other bomb, and you're in the same boat, so you're never really controlling or dictating the pace of the game as the control deck, which is exactly where you do not want to be on a control deck. You really want to control the pace of the game, whether that's through like bluff equity and your hidden information, or your ability to just interact at instant speed and control the pace of the game so that your opponent's basically in a bunch of forced lines and you get to make the relevant decisions in the game. But I think that's becoming less and less possible just due to, I mean, what some people call power creep, which I think is fine. I mean, I think like the game changing is a good thing. I don't, think everything needs to be like a Drago-esque, kind of game. Like, I don't think a lot of folks enjoy that. It's not as fun. But I do still think that you can actually play Control in this format and in others. I think it's still viable. I mean, it is changing. But I think it ends up looking something more like what you have in front of you here, which is what to me, as an older player, would be archetypically just like my old school senses tell me this is a mid-range deck. I just look at it and I'm like, yeah, this is a mid-range deck. It's pretty solid, but it's a mid-range deck. I think honestly by today's standards it's probably just a control deck. 18 creatures. I mean, like, generally mid-range is somewhere between 20 to like 24. Abzan can go up a lot more because it's more of a creature-heavy deck. Or it has creature-heavy. It's creature-heavy because it uses a lot of white creatures to have like the interactive /staxy / denial-based effects. It's kind of using them as spells like Thalia's and like Raminep Excavator. Like, those are effects that you, if they were on a spell, like, you'd probably still play them, but like they're on a body, so you just run it because it can also clock. It's kind of like virtual card advantage because you have a clock plus the effect that you want in your deck. This is a little more threat light, a little more on the controlling side. I think honestly this probably just is Esper Control. What Esper Control probably has to look like, giving a varied metagame, because it offers you a lot more tempo lines. Like, against the combo decks, like, you have a ton of hand attack, ton of like card advantage hand attack, but you also have the ability to kill them fast with just random stuff like Gideon, Ally of Zendikar, the Restoration Angel, Monastery Mentor, Gideon of the Trials, which is also just instantly a hate piece for combo. We have a lot of threats. So kind of what I've done here, and I'll quickly kind of cover these piles. You have 10 cards that are pretty much committed hand zone disruption. And I went possibly a little more than I had to in this pile because I really wanted to, as kind of like for science, just... This is the distinguishing mark that Esper has over Jeskai, and like I really wanted to like have a decent bit of this in the deck because I think one, there's a lot of great card advantage cards that are also hand zone disruption. Now, against certain decks, this sort of interaction is going to scale less well because they're going to play their cards out and not have much in hand. But against a lot of others, it's going to be just, great 2-for-1 advantage. Some of it is not. Some of it's just point removal or point hand attack, like Duress, Thoughtseize, Inquisition. The problem you run into with this is it doesn't scale as well over time, because if they are playing their hand short, like, and you draw an Inquisition late or a Gerard's Verdict late, it's going to do nothing, because if they're not keeping cards in their hand zone, these cards don't do anything. So they can be bad top decks in a longer game. But like I was saying, like one of the benefits to playing a more tempo-oriented or more creature-heavy control build is that you don't have to let the games go long if you don't want to. You're not running anymore like 24 to 30 counter spells. You're running like maybe like 12, to 15, just the best of them. Which is kind of what this deck is doing. So I do think hand attack's equity goes up a little bit when you build like that, because you're not going to have a long enough game where you're going to see so much of it that like you're going to lose to a top decking it in the long game. The game will tend to come to a conclusion before that because you have things that actually attack them for damage and win the game. This next pile here is kind of the threat pile, and like there's a lot of cards that could jump over to other piles. Like sort of Fire and Ice could jump over to the board impact pile. It can just kill things, and intrinsically cards that can attack and block also do have just board impact. They're board impacting spells. And actually, Custody Lich is not just a pure threat; it's board control. It can go over here. But yeah, there should be some interwoven synergies between this pile and then this other pile over here, which I call the board control pile or the board impact pile. But these are in general just the pure threats. Like they're just pure threats, and like they do have some incidental value. Like this Gideon right here just houses storm decks, and it's a 4/4 for 3, which is good, and it can also just blank a threat. So I mean, this card has a lot of impact on board as well. This next pile here is just a selection pile. Not a ton of selection. Like I was kind of saying in the first video of this, like I do not look at this build specifically as kind of like a Xerox deck. Like a lot of the Xerox decks, I think generally tend to give up card quality for higher selection, and efficiency. So selection and efficiency, and range. So you generally want the most efficient, powerful answer for things like Flame Slash is a good card in that style of deck because like Flame Slash does not have like great. It doesn't have range. It's power. Flame Slash does not have good range. Like it's only great in certain situations. But if you have a vast amount of card selection, you don't have to draw it. And when you do want that effect, you want it like very powerful. You want it to be very powerful. You'd rather have that than something like Firebolt. But if you want to careful study it away, you can careful study it away. If you want to brainstorm it away, you can brainstorm it away. You name it. There's a lot of ways to get rid of it if you have more of these style of cantrip cards. Right now, I'm playing only really 4 cantrips. Serum Visions is close to the chopping board. One moment, guys. Let me go on a pause. Alright guys, back. So, Serum Vision's kind of close to the chopping block. The reason I'm running it in this list over something like an Opt or like Sleight of Hand is because I think it's a little better in the early turns. It's kind of a good card to help, form a plan early or develop, yourself between turns 2 to 3. As you go along, this card gets worse. It has less equity, but in general, I think it's a little bit better in this style of deck than Sleight is, because of how good it is at setting up formative turns. That could be wrong. And like I said, it is pretty close to being chopped off, this deck. I don't think this card scales as well into the long game, but in the early to mid game, it's fine. Alright, next pile here you have is like the stack interaction and other zone interaction. So like Kaya and Deathrite Shaman are in this pile because they both interact with the graveyard zone, which is something that like Esper, typically speaking, doesn't have great access to. I guess you do in white. You have stuff like Rest in Peace, but like Rest in Peace is really not a great card unless you're using it to have a combination style deck, like an enchantment style combination deck with like replenish into like Rest in Peace, Energy Field, or something like that. Like could be combo that some decks run. and that's fine. It's a fine deck. It's just a very, very different deck. So it's pretty tough to have good graveyard disruption in this style of deck. I mean, it's not hard to get it, but it's hard to have good cards that actually do that. And the verdict for me is still kind of out on Kaya. I'm not sure if I'm sold on her, but she does kind of deal with some important artifacts that are in the format with her minus ability. And she also combats delve and graveyard-based strategies quite well. And eventually she can just win the game. She's not really a great Planeswalker from the standpoint of passing the Planeswalker test. Does this thing protect itself? And does it accrue advantage? I don't think she protects herself all that well. But she can accrue long-term advantage. And she can just randomly win games as well. Verdict for me still out on her, though. And the rest of this is just all stack interaction. It's just counter magic. So like I said, I guess I was a little bit over. It's not 12, it's 13. There's 13 counter spells in this deck. And some of them are not they double as counter spells. Like Spell Queller can just be a threat too. I've definitely played this out in this deck just as a 2/3 to carry equipment or to fly over and kind of just basically force action. It's just still a fine tempo threat. It's not a 3/1 like Nimble Obstructionist or the Vidillion Clique, but it can force action. It's a clock. This last pile is the board interaction. Just the board impacting cards. Custody Lich, just kills something when it comes to play, draws you cards. So it does some of this. It does a little bit of everything. But really, why you're playing is because, one, you're playing because it says you get the Monarchy, right? That's the first reason you're playing it. But the effect of being able to just get them to edict off a creature is really powerful, especially if you're playing against another mid-range deck or a control deck that has some big dumb bomb down. It's untargeted, so it can deal with the true name. It's just very powerful effect. Hostage Taker. So this deck is specifically kind of tuned up for creature-heavy metagames. Not creature... Well, yeah, more creature-heavy. More fair decks, let's say. And Hostage Taker is pretty good against fair decks. The fact that it has the modality of being able to get artifacts is not irrelevant, because you can just steal a Mox or a Ring or something like that if you're not already dead. But being able to steal their best thing or their most efficient thing so you can recast at the turn you play the Hostage Taker is just very good. I've kind of found I like this card. I think it's quite good. Yeah, I think this is a flex slot card, though. I think you could take this out and put something else in that may have more impact. The cards that immediately come to mind are Lavinia and Kambal. I'm not running them right now because I don't tend to play against a lot of Storm in the online meta. But if I were playing against more unfair decks, I think those would be probably some pretty good go-tos for this deck, just to kind of have an early threat that kind of juices a control or a combo deck, and then also disrupts them significantly. Yeah, Palace Jailer card is just a bomb. If you can run this card in the deck you're playing, you should probably run it. Plague Engineer. So this card's really sweet too. This is one of the new ads I was talking about. It's kind of like a Grey Ogre that has a miniature Infest or miniature Toxic Deluge on it. It's one-sided. Elves are good to name with it. Kills a lot of mana dorks. Elementals I've actually found is not irrelevant against Young Pyromancer. Humans against Death and Taxes. Goblins is a deck. And even against a deck like Red Deck Wins, if they have this is a turn 3 play, but if they've developed 1-drop into 2-drop, maybe you countered their 3-drop if you were on the draw, and then you play this thing. Generally speaking, you kill one of the threats they've played out with it, and then you can block the other threat they played out with it. So it's really just a pretty good 2-for-1 / tempo piece that really gets a lot of stuff in the format. Now, if I was in a more combo-heavy meta, maybe Plague Engineer would go to the sideboard, but I think it's a good enough hedge at the rate that you still kind of enjoy having this card in your deck. Toxic Deluge, this is just this is the only Wrath effect that's in this deck. And realistically, it's not even really technically a Wrath, because sometimes you're just going to kill their little stuff with it, and your bigger stuff will stay alive. But I think you need at least one effect like this where you can just, use your Demonic Tutor, your Tainted Pact to find it to not lose a game that you are certainly going to lose. Card's very powerful. Vindicate, but it's also efficient, which is kind of the big thing. I think if I was in a 2-color deck, I'd possibly look to run more basics, more snowlands, and go with Dead of Winter, but this is not really a deck for Dead of Winter. We're only running 5 basic lands, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, 5 basics, so not really a card I can get away with. Vindicate, just powerful board interaction. Teferi, board impact, bounces something, disrupts their game plan, so it can kind of go into the disruption pile over here. That must be said about Teferi. 3 Teferi, he's very, very powerful. And against some decks, just completely goozles them. Liliana, the Last Hope. This card is just great value. It's good board control against aggressive decks. The only matchup that's really bad in his combo. Baleful Strix replaces itself. Generally tends to be basically an onboard removal spell. Also flies, so it carries equipment well if you want to get over stuff and just hit with your Sword of Fire and Ice. You name it. Malicious Affliction. This is a card I'm also trying out that's relatively new. It has the ability to be a 2-for-1 card. One of your creatures gets removed and your opponent has 2 to 3 threats on board. And you're holding this up. It's kind of a blowout. It puts them down to basically 1 onboard creature resource, or maybe knocks all of them out. Go for the Throat, just good removal. There are artifact creatures in the format, but I think in general, like, this tends to get most things. I ended up taking Doomblade out for the Malicious Affliction. It's a little harder to cast, but it does the same thing. It's floor. I guess it's floor. It's uncastable because you don't have double black, but the mana is pretty well set up in this deck to get to double black. You have filter lands, you have 10 fetches with 11 fetchable lands, so you have a lot of choice over what mana you get. I think the floor on this is basically the same thing as Doomblade, and like the ceiling on it is you get a 2-for-1 for pretty much nothing. Path Exile, Sword to Plowshares, yep. Jit, yep. These all just control the board. Jit is really intended in this deck to be a board control card that incidentally wins. In some decks, Jit is intended to like just be there to win, I think. But mostly, I look at this card as a board control card. The ability to just completely goozle combat with the +2/+2 ability, so like it's hard to block. The ability to just remove stuff with the -1/-1 ability, and then like just gaining life in this deck can be relevant because if you're playing it's like a deck like Red Deck Wins. I don't think it's actually a horrible matchup for this deck, but this card solidifies it as being a better matchup if you have access to it. And then Caracas and Wasteland, just good board control. So, anyways, that is this build, guys. I kind of covered more of the cards than I wanted to. Not significant changes to it. I think the biggest change is probably taking out Spellseeker and going Mana Drain. And the biggest reason I wanted to do that is because I wanted the deck to have more tempo lines in it, so that it basically had the ability to shift more rapidly. And this is not a deck that's fully exploiting the power of Spellseeker. I'm not going to get like Time Walk and just combo off. I'm generally speaking just getting an answer with it, but I feel like Spellseeker kind of is a more controlling card, or it's being used as more of a controlling card in this deck than it is as a flexible card that can either go controlling or aggressive or mid-rangey. Whereas Mana Drain is a controlling card. I mean, it counters a spell, but it also generates a fast mana advantage, which can allow you to drop a Jace the Mind Sculptor with counterspell backup, have an early dig through time, drop a Gideon into counterspell backup. You name it. Like, just that big mana boost is really huge. And generally speaking, it's going to allow you to drop a threat and also leave up interaction to either disrupt or stop your opponent from doing what they're doing. So I think Drain's actually really great in this deck. Probably not at its highest, but it's quite good. I've been very happy with the card so far. Anyways, guys, quick pause. I'm going to jump into a game against Stefan Bard. So Stefan Bard is a big-time Esper fan. He loves Esper. He loves Esper Control, and so do I. I love blue-white, splash-black control. It's one of my favorite ways to play the game, probably the old school way of playing it, which is like basically kind of a Drago-esque, hand attack, Wrath of God kind of deck. Just very, very controlling, like 0 creatures, maybe like a Snapcaster and a JVP in my deck, and that's it. And I enjoy playing that way, but I do think it's kind of becoming antiquated. And I'm going to cover the game and kind of show like some of the differences. He's playing an old school Esper deck. I'm going to be playing this Esper, what I call mid-range, maybe Esper New Age control deck. I don't know, but I'll showcase a game against him with it and kind of showcase some of the differences in both decks and kind of where the advantages come in playing more of a mid-range build. Over like the older school kind of control variety of it. So quick pause, guys. I'll be back momentarily with some gameplay. All right, guys, back. All right, so this is an acceptable hand. It has a turn 2 Dark Confidant. I'm not gonna. I know Stefan plays pretty much exclusively control by reputation, and then by watching about like 5 to 6 of his games. And I also know he's a very good control pilot. Like, I know that's kind of his jam. He's been doing it for a while. So I can reasonably expect that he's on some variety of control, likely some variety of Esper control. So I try to keep in the dark, like, I don't know that. This hand's not great against some things, because Batterskull is kind of a Mulva 6 already. You generally don't want that in your opener. But it has a lot of selection with the Tainted Pact. It also has a turn 2 Dark Confidant, which can be good in a variety of matchups. It allow me to get back up on cards and hopefully find more mana resources for this hand. It's got a Snapcaster once I've developed my mana base more to get back a Tainted Pact or a Call Brute or anything else I might find. And that's got Collective Brutality to kind of deal with anything that happens on the board in the interim. So I think it's got enough going on as basically a quote-unquote 6-card hand hand, then it's definitely a keep. Opponent plays out Celestial Colonnade here. Play out the Polluted Delta, say go. I think here, maybe it was more correct to not play out Polluted Delta, to play around like Stifle and stuff, or maybe like, yeah, maybe not. I like the Polluted Delta play here. I go ahead and just find the Watery Grave. So, the way Stefan plays this, I like the way he plays this. So, I think, folks who try to play Control, like, there's a lot of different approaches to it. It's not unlikely that Stefan also has a counterspell in hand, but having seen a Polluted Delta, I think I would in general assume that his opponent, Lowman02, is on either like a combo deck or a control deck. And he actually knows this because, we've been talking about wanting to play some control mirrors for a while. So he can pretty safely assume I'm on control. But I think regardless, playing out the Search for Iskanta, especially on the play on turn 2, is very powerful because it's going to allow him to set up for the long game very well. It's a very threatening card in control mirrors. And even if I'm on a more aggressive deck, I still kind of think that's a good play because it's going to allow him to set up for the long game, which the way he wins this game is by getting to the long game and having an engine online that also is going to ramp him in the mid game to help control the board. That said, he's going to get punished here because I have a Dark Confidant, which is basically a must counter or must kill in the next turn, or else I'm going to get some free cards off of it. And in general, my life total is not going to be under attack in this matchup, so it's going to be pretty much kill the Bob or bust. So go back to play. I play out the Bob. He's tapped out. I think the psychic play, if he had counter magic, is to just leave up the counter magic to deal with the Bob. But he can't know that, and I think in general it's the right play to play out the Search because it sets you up for the long game the best, and is the highest value, highest upside, highest value play. It's the play to win, is I guess what I mean. So gets a portent off, good old slow trip, but he's tapped out at this point because my assumption is he probably had to. So what does the Field of Ruin play tell us? The Field of Ruin play on his turn tells me that he doesn't have interaction in hand. So he probably played out the Search just because he didn't have good stack interaction in hand. The reason he Field of Runes here is because he wants to get the portent off on his own turn. Field of Runes is going to leave him with 1 mana so that he can still get the portent off. But it also sets up his Search for Iskanta to flip in a more timely fashion. It does assume some risk because I'm going to see more cards, and if I'm able to deal with the Search for Iskanta, then I'm going to deal with it. Now, if I didn't have... I drew into the Vindicate. We all know that now because we saw it come off my Bob, and he knows it as well. Now, if I didn't have interaction, I think this is a good line again, because if I don't have interaction, then he's just setting up for the long game better by making this play. The downside to this play is that if I'm a skillful pilot and I'm able to read the signs, then I have a good deal of hidden information solved about his hand. Namely that I don't think his hand is likely to have a lot of stack interaction or as much stack interaction. Basically, situational stack interaction or none. He plays out land here, plays out Supreme Verdict. So this is kind of one of the things I was talking about in the beginning. Supreme Verdict is a great card, don't get me wrong, and I still play it in blue, white, black control, but it's tough, right, because the Bob just needs to be dealt with, and if Supreme Verdict is the only way you have to deal with it, then you do it, because you can't allow me to... If you allow me to get one more card off of this, I'm probably just going to win the game. So what I do from my perspective, there's a couple of things I can do here. I think the best way to deal with control is just to present one game-ending or basically game-ending threatening threat on the board. And Monastery Mentor is exactly that. You see a Monastery Mentor as a control player, and you're like, oh shit, I got to kill this thing. So I guess his turn. He plays on a Spell Seeker. It's hard to tell if he had the Seeker in hand last turn or if he drew into it this turn. I don't think he would per se play Seeker out over Supreme Verdict to Swords to Plowshares, my Bob. I think, honestly, it's probably more likely that he had the Spell Seeker in hand and also had the Supreme Verdict in hand and opted to use the Supreme Verdict as an answer to the Bob because he wanted to generate more options with Spell Seeker. Yeah, I think that makes the most sense. I think he's a skillful enough pilot. That's probably how he would do it. He would probably not use Seeker right away. But here he just has to use the Swords to Plowshares to get rid of this thing because it'll end the game pretty quickly. Or at least it threatens that very well, especially with me on a full grip. I think it's a safe assumption to think that the Monastery Mentor is basically a 2-turn clock at that point. Is it with my hand? No, not really. My hand's actually kind of mana choked. I draw to a Geist here. Geist is a great threat against other Esper decks. The Spellseeker can kind of chump block it if he's able to get a relevant Planeswalker down. If he hits his next land, he can get this Celestial Colonnade down, or get it operational, which can block Geist as well. But it's really a big cost to have to tap down like that to just be able to deal with one threat. And it allows me to kind of just do a lot of other bullshit to kind of continue to put the game state in a place where it's not good for him. Opponent goes ahead and casts on a Factor Fiction. So I had another interesting line here. There's been a couple times in this game where I could have cast Tainted Pact to find a land drop. That's kind of like the higher floor, lower ceiling play. I actually opt to keep it because I think in general my deck's more mana efficient than Stefan's deck is. And I think that because of that, I can beat him on mana efficiency of my spells. Mana efficiency plus power of my spells. Now, he casts the Factor Fiction out. I'm not going to let him get basically 2 to 3 cards off of this. I use Tainted Pact to go find a counterspell. In this case, it's Mana Leak. Mana Leak his Factor Fiction. This also is nice because now I have Snapcaster with access to a counterspell. Stefan plays out Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. This is a very good card. So, I've kind of held on to this Collected Brutality. Batterskull is finally going to find a use and get pitched to an escalated Collected Brutality. Killing off the Spellseeker and taking an instant or sorcery out of my opponent's hand. It's very likely he has a counterspell. Here when he casts this, I think he probably has Logic Knot, but it's actually just dig through time to build up hand capacity. So this does resolve. Alright, quick pause again, guys. So we look at his hand. His hand consists of Swords of Plowshares, Mystic Confluence, Condescend, Sensei's Divining Top. I'm sorry, not all of that. I believe it consists of... No, it doesn't consist of Swords of Plowshares. You found that before. It consists of Mystic Confluence, Condescend, Sensei's Divining Top, Hyrule Illumination, and Personal Tutor. I think Personal Tutor is the right take from this hand because Personal Tutor has the ability to find Terminus or Entreat the Angels, which basically means that Stefan has the flexibility to find a way to deal with a pretty difficult to deal with board presence, and or just find Entreat and try to win the game. Yeah. So I end up killing the Spellseeker because this allows me to push through quote-unquote lethal damage on Teferi, Hero of Dominaria here. And also leaves up, some hidden information, like some counterspell. Like maybe I have a counterspell up right now. I don't, but maybe I do. He goes ahead and plays out the top. I kind of like how he plays this. I think, he's lost his PT. He's going to end up leaving up the Hieroglyphic Illumination here. He's not going to just slam it main phase. He's going to wait to probably slam it during my EOT. I think in the general case that's correct. I think in the median case that's generally correct. It's possible. I don't know. He's in a tough spot here, right? Like I have the board developed. He has to answer it. It's very tough. And like these counter spells, like this Mystic Confluence, this kind of center, just not very good once you are kind of behind. Especially against like a threat like this, it's kind of tough to get back ahead with them. When I say like a threat like this, I mean like an uninteractive threat. Like a Planeswalker or a Geist are kind of similar in that regard. They're just uninteractive threats. Or they're threats that require a very specific interaction. I cast out Snapcaster here. I just counter this because I actually don't want him to find a land drop. I want him to have to draw a land drop here. He goes ahead and tops. Doesn't either find the... Well, at this point, land doesn't matter. It's basically I tied up his 1 mana so he can't activate the Celestial Colonnade. So I've got lethal on board. And unless he finds like an Entreat or a an Entreat or a Terminus, we're in a pretty good spot to just lock up this game. And if he finds like a 4 mana Wrath and just wraths the board, then I can drop a Kaya and just start eating apart his hand and building up my hand and basically just gaining further advantage. So you got to see like an older school style Esper Control deck versus this lower curve, mid-rangey control deck, and I think you kind of get to see like the advantages of like this newer age build of control, of Esper Control. It embraces efficiency to a much higher extent. It's the ceiling on its cards is a lot lower than the ceiling on the cards that are in the control deck, but the median case for its cards is a lot higher. It's a little more grindy. It's generally just going to be 2 for 1, 2 for 1 advantage over like 3 to 4 for 1 advantage off Wrath effects or like the big bomby Planeswalkers like Teferi. But because the deck's more efficient, it has like these outs to playing more of a tempo game plan, which in general tends to command the pace and the action in a game, which I think that's really what a control deck's all about. It's about controlling the action and pace of a game. And sometimes you do that by presenting efficient clocks that require your opponent to have specific cards to answer them. And sometimes you do that by playing out just a Planeswalker or having a discard spell. But I think really what it ties back to is just efficiency. I think in order to kind of play this game plan, you have to embrace a lot more efficiency and have a lot more tempo and board impacting plays in the early to mid game. And just cards that attack. Like, you need to kind of have some of that because you don't want games to go forever anymore. There's just too many threats. Like, everything is so lethal that if one of those things gets through, it just ends the game. And Stefan and I were talking about it. We're like, yeah, I really wish, like, Esper Control, like the style that he's playing was still, like, really, like, a good, solid Tier 1 strategy. I just don't think, in general, it tends to be. It can win tournaments, don't get me wrong. It's a very good deck, and in the hands of a capable pilot like Stefan, like, it'll win a lot of games, but I think it's getting tougher and tougher just due to the independent card power and quality and in depth. There's just so many. It's the Siege Rhino syndrome. Like, I just keep on dropping these things that, you have to answer, and if you don't, the last one it's either the first one that gets through or the last one that gets through, but like one of those two kills you on control. It's kind of one of the things I say, it's either that first turn Jackal Pup that you just never deal with that eventually beats you to death, or it's that, turn 10 Hell Rider that you've countered everything else and finally this thing hits and it just kills you. So yeah. Anyways, guys, quick pause to come back for game number 2 against Stefan here. All right, guys, back. Yeah, this hand's great. Again, it has a Bob, which, Bob is a great card in this matchup. Like, it's just something that Stefan has to deal with. And from seeing his build and, like, kind of knowing how these old-school controlled style decks play, it's actually a lot harder for them to remove one threat than it is for them to remove, like, 3 to 4 threats at a time. Because they're looking to get a lot of card advantage out of their cards, but they're generally doing it at the cost of efficiency. So my guess is he's probably playing, like, Fatal Push, Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, maybe a Dismember, but not a ton of one-for-one removal. I play out my land here. So the plan here is kind of interesting. Like, oftentimes, like, and I hate doing this play, but, like, oftentimes it is incorrect to brainstorm on your opponent's EOT, but this hand really lends itself well to brainstorming EOT, because if my brainstorm gets countered, it's kind of rough. It's kind of rough if it's countered on my turn, because then I don't have the ability to have a tempo impacting play on their turn, like Mana Drain or Mana Leak. Mana Drain is probably a game winner, because I can just, if I Mana Drain a 3-drop, I can fetch for an Underground Sea, Demonic Tutor for a white land, and still play out a Palace Jailer, which is a game-ending threat. If I play the Brainstorm on their turn and they don't do nothing, then they can counter it, but if they counter it, then I can just land a Bob, which is a pretty low, it's a good median play, because if I don't draw into land, then I want to have something down that they have to deal with. So brainstorming EOT makes the most sense here. That's why I kind of go for that line. Plus, I don't have a land drop to make this turn, so brainstorming when I don't have a land drop seems a little bit weaker. So go ahead and brainstorm EOT. I really want to just find mana here. I think if I find mana, it's going to be hard for me to lose. All these cards are great. So the only card I don't want, I don't fetch here, EOT, because the only card I don't want is the Swords to Plowshares. I don't think that card's that relevant in this matchup. And now I have so they cycle off their miscalc. So, I mean, as you can see, they have interaction for my turn, but it's just if I don't do anything, it kind of makes it irrelevant. But, miscalc cycling off is still pretty good. But being able to get rid of it when you don't think it's going to be relevant is nice. I go ahead and just cast on a Vidillion Click here. He doesn't have to counter this, but if he doesn't, it's just a threat that's going to continue to beat him down. I could have done it during the draw step, but I kind of like doing it here EOT, because I actually don't mind if he counters it. The reason I do this is because I kind of want him to counter that, so I can play this Bob and then have him on 2 mana, where I can actually use my counterspell to counter his counterspell, or I can use my counterspell to deal with, his 1-for-1 removal, which in this case is Fatal Push. Now, if he has something like Spell Snare or Pierce, yeah, he gets me, but I've eaten 2 cards up at that point, and I don't feel too bad about that. He plays a Pull for Tomorrow, which is kind of, it's a very powerful card, but in this point in the game, it's really just a compulsive research for 2 extra mana. Of course, Miser's going to Mise. I draw out my Hymn to Turek, and, is this lucky? Yeah, it isn't bad. It is pretty lucky. But when you're playing a deck more like this mid-rangey control build that I've got, you have a lot of bomb cards. You have a lot of 2-for-1 cards. I probably would have been happier if I just drawn a Kaya there, to eat one of their cards and draw a new card and to use my mana more efficiently. But Hymn to Turek is obviously also good. I mean, but at the end of the day, I'm just kind of playing a stack of good cards, and I think in general that's going to be very problematic for his style of deck, because if I get these turns where he taps out to evade my counter magic, which I do think that's the right play, I think knowing how these older school Esper builds are made, you really want to get off your draw 3. You want to get off this good card selection card, Pull from Tomorrow. If it gets countered, you're not probably winning the game. And if it doesn't get countered, it generates a lot of options to use many for 1 answers or find a Planeswalker to deal with the board state. I guess what I mean is his card power level is so much higher than mine, that he wants to really get after generating options to build into that card power. The problem is they're just not efficient. So if I'm able to mana drain his next play, it's very good. He goes ahead and portents here, probably looking to generate options, turn down the road, and or find counter magic for my turn. When I see him play out a 4-drop here, the Supreme Verdict, to kill my thing, I figure he's probably trying to generate an option for the next turn, probably like a Walker or something on top of his deck, because he did not shuffle with this portent. Goes ahead and takes his draw here. I unfortunately draw to a tapped land. If this is not a tapped land, I probably just lock up the game entirely here. But getting to slam a Palace Jailer basically says, hey, have Force of Will or lose the game. To me, it does. Draw to a Plague Engineer, not very good in this matchup. It's just, it's a Grey Ogre in this matchup. Stefan plays out Mind Twist, which in general, if I had just tapped down for something, probably wins him the game. But Palace Jailer, it's just, look at this card. Palace Jailer is so stupid. I'm probably still going to win, even though I just got Mind Twisted for 4. I draw to a Tainted Pact, which is not a bad draw. Find the Kaya that I was talking about that I would have rather had before. Go ahead and force him to discard a card, draw a card. He discards his Absorb. I draw to a Gideon, which is another card that is just a must counter because it'll kill you. It kills you quite fast, and it's also kind of tough to deal with. Draw again, find land. Go ahead and Kaya to get rid of another card in his hand. He ditches a counter spell. Play on a Monastery Mentor. Say, hey, have another counter spell. If you don't, you lose, and he just loses here. So, I know for a fact Stefan is a great control player. It kind of showcases just where I think these strategies kind of need to go in the format, and just in Magic in general. It's really hard to kind of play the old school Drago-esque, vast card advantage kind of, control decks, because everything is just so goddamn lethal. This Palace Jailer hits, and it doesn't matter that I lost 4 cards, and 3 of them were really good. Collective Brutality, Demonic Tutor, and Mana Drain were really good. Plague Engineer less good in this matchup. But, I lost 4 cards, and it just didn't matter. It's Palace Jailer's out. I'm going to draw into more bombs, so I'm playing more of these kind of bomby cards because I've gone more of a mid-range route. And I just tend to think tends to be where these control decks need to go. I think you can still kind of get away with playing blue-white Miracles. I don't tend to think it's a tier 1 deck anymore. I think it's good, but I don't think it's a tier 1 deck. I just think it's tough, right? Because you really have to kind of you have to get lucky in Magic in general. You have to play well. It's a given. But you also need to get kind of lucky to win, any game of Magic to some extent. It varies based on the matchup, based on who you're playing against, etc. But I think more needs to line up for the big mana control decks than it does for something like the deck that I'm playing, where you have a lot more match neutrality built into the deck, and at the end of the day, your card quality, vice efficiency, vice relevance is just higher. And you kind of get to see that showcased here. So, anyways, guys, I kind of want to cover this because I love Control to death. It was really great to get to play against Stefan because I love playing against old school control players. And it's very easy to notice an old school control player just by how they play. And it's always an honor to play against those kind of folks because it's just you don't see it as much anymore. And I miss it. But that all said, I do think the arc is just changing. It's just changing quite a bit. It's just vastly different. There's really not a great draw grow deck in this format, I don't think. If there is, it's probably blue-white, maybe Splash Black, Miracle Control. But yeah, I just think it's tough. And even that deck I do think needs to run more creatures now. I think it's a must to run Vendilion Click, even Mind Sensor, and Nimble Obstructionist in that deck. I even like Restoration Angel in that deck now. You just need cards that can have board impact and can end games faster than turn 20. Yeah. But anyways, guys, I wanted to share this because I think this is these games and some of the dialogue that I had with Stefan after the game really kind of sparked me wanting to kind of share this idea, because I've had in my guts, I felt for a long time that Control was just kind of dying off. But I wanted to showcase this game because I think it does kind of showcase it. Because I know Stefan's a good player. I think I'm a decent player. But I think, in general, you just look at how this game played out. And, it's kind of almost at this point strategy superiority for Control, I think, to kind of go this way. And I kind of want to share that for, the Control players out there, for the Blue Mages out there, for the folks that want to grind out there. I think, you got to kind of go this route. I think this is the route to go. Now, I don't think this Esper pile that I've got is perfect. I'm still screwing around with it, still trying to get it right. I've been changing it a little bit here and there, like I said, with the points. Do I think it's perfect? No. No, I don't think it's perfect whatsoever. I just think it's going in the direction that it kind of needs to go for how the game is changing. Just too many bombs, guys. Too many bombs. Everything kills you. Everything's a Mike Tyson punch. If you get hit once, like it's just like, all right, the game's over. So as opposed to trying to stop everything, just have the best stuff that stops the relevant stuff, and then have a little bit more of a proactive game plan. And I think, in general, that's going to tend to serve the quote-unquote control decks, maybe they're just mid-range decks now, a lot better. Anyways, guys, hope this was helpful, formative, entertaining, whatever you may have come for. Enjoy, guys, and take care.